Earlier this week, I know it might sound shocking, but at the dinner table, our kids were complaining to us. We don't get to choose anything in our life like you adults. We don't get anything we want. Life is not fair. And you get whatever you want. You get to choose everything. We don't have any freedom, they said. Well, it didn't take long for us to respond. If you don't appreciate what you have, what we've given you, then we'll just start taking it away. Their tone changed relatively quickly. And it reminded us that while we are adults, it doesn't mean we always have to respond very maturely. And the truth is, while the question that our kids asked is probably something that we ourselves asked, and it wasn't the first time that they made such comments, their question at this season should be taken seriously, because this is our season of inviting our kids to ask questions. And their question is a good one. Not because they should have more freedom or more choices or more stuff, but because Passover, this is our season of comparing our suffering and our celebrations. From my kids' perspective, their life is filled with suffering, and our adult lives filled with celebration. But in the view of the Seder, all of us must experience some suffering if we are to ever understand that we are going to celebrate. And of course, that too is a lesson for our children to recognize that while they may look at our lives or someone else's and see only wonderful, great things that they don't get to experience, that part of what we do this week is remind ourselves that all of us, Jewish or not, have some sort of an Egypt in our lives. But I want to take a step back. There's a wonderful passage written by the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks about Passover. He writes, "If you want to understand a people, listen to the way it tells its stories. Some cultures rely on myths and fairy tale endings," he explains, "but not Judaism. Judaism has no such stories because for Judaism, the battle against evil is never complete. There is no myth that leads to this is now a happy ever after." And then he says there are other people like the Greeks who created the genre of the tragedy. Different stories that don't end with happy endings. But that's not us either. While we have no shortage of painful moments in Jewish history, he says, we do not tell our story as a tragedy either. Judaism, he writes, is the principled rejection of tragedy in the name of hope. The Jewish narrative does not ask us to believe in a world in which there are simple, happy endings, nor does it allow us to take refuge in the cynical belief that every aspiration ends in failure, he says. So here's what he says it does. The Jewish story, to be a Jew, is to choose difficult liberty over easy necessity. Israel, says the Torah, is the people whose name means one who struggles with God, who struggles with humanity, and who chooses to prevail. And so let me take a second, less sarcastic, less pointed approach to my children's question. A more Pesach-like approach. For it is the season when we should listen to our children's questions and give them a serious answer. Why is it that sometimes in life we find ourselves without many or perhaps any choices? And why is it that sometimes we look at others with envy of all they seem to have, and particularly the many choices they get to make that we don't feel are ours to make? The story we tell at Passover, it gives us that answer. as a dialogue, a stark reminder that Jewish stories are about the deep, inevitable connection between our suffering and our celebration. We are told in the Midrash that at Passover, we are to first talk about the suffering and then talk about the celebration, that the two are wed to each other. Two chapters to the same story. And so, as you know, this week around our Seder table, we will eat that bland, crunchy, tasteless matzah, along with the bitter maror, dipping the parsley in that sorrowful salt water. We will sit in the suffering. And if your Seder is anything like ours, we'll even add our own rituals to that suffering. The terrible dad jokes, the off-key singing, the food that smells up the house but that you can't eat for hours on end. The impatience of kids matched by the impatience of adults. Part of Passover is about suffering and owning it. And so the answers to your first questions are that we have to notice the times when we suffer, because never in our history, from the times when we were enslaved in Egypt until now, have we been the only people on earth who suffer, just like you are not the only kids who don't have all the choices you want. You aren't even the only people. We notice our suffering because if we did not take note of it, we wouldn't know how to see the suffering of others. We notice our suffering because it increases our compassion. And so, the suffering of a 10-year-old, suffering of an adult, while not always filled with great meaning, sometimes has a deep purpose. We read in the Haggadah that the Seder is not complete unless we talk about the Pesach sacrifice, the matzah, and the maror. And so in Judaism, we believe that we will notice another person's sacrifice if we are reminded what it must have been like to give up something that we deeply wanted. Can you imagine being a slave in Egypt? Being told that you would be free, but not being free yet, and saying, first you must make a sacrifice of this animal, this huge feast. You must give that up before you can go free. At Passover, how can we not empathize with those who have had to sacrifice so much? As we eat matzah, how can we not taste a little bit of what it must be like for someone who does not get to choose what their food is for every meal? To realize that there are some people who don't get the chance to enjoy the food that they have before them, as we so often cherish what we eat around a meal in a restaurant, when we sit around with family and enjoy that meal. And when we eat the maror, we remind ourselves of the taste of something bitter. The way it lingers on our taste buds, stings a little bit. Isn't that the way it feels when you're shunned by the world? Isn't that what it must have felt like to some degree to those people who've been targeted lately, the Asian community, in recent years, the Jewish community and the black community? Doesn't it feel like the sting of something terribly bitter when you know that the world does not extend its hand to you? When you feel cut off from opportunity? The bitterness of feeling alone is not that different from the bitterness of that maror. And so our stories begin with suffering this week. As children, sometimes we feel our lives begin that way too. But that's not how the Jewish story ends. It ends, as the Seder does, with celebration. For every ritual we suffer through at Passover, there is one to be enjoyed. We recline in our chairs as if we are royalty. We drink 4 glasses of wine or grape juice. And I can promise you my children enjoy their grape juice as much as the adults enjoy their wine. We sing together and eat a festive meal. We open the door for the magical hope of Elijah. We get a reward for finding the Afikomen. There is so much joy and celebration around a Passover table, and it's in dialogue with that suffering. This is not an accident. While not all suffering has a purpose, much of our suffering does. Celebration in Judaism is not a result of just showing up. It's not about reaching a birthday. It's about achievement. We break the fast at Yom Kippur because we've done the work to repent. We eat latkes on Hanukkah because we celebrate those who fought for Jewish rights. We dress up at Purim because we find joy in the justice that Esther brought. At Passover, we drink 4 times, we recline, we sing, we eat a festive meal because Moses, the Israelites, every generation of our people in some way has marched toward freedom. Celebration in Judaism is not a birthday party that celebrates a year or a day. It's not about counting something. Celebration in Judaism is about marking achievement. It is an accomplishment. I would liken it to what some psychologists call an accomplishment anchor, something that we hang on our mantle to remind us of how much we've done, but also to encourage us, to be an anchor for us, a foundation for what we can do in the future. And so we gather at Passover to remind ourselves of the pharaohs we've faced, and we leave the Seder inspired to fight the pharaohs that we are facing today. Isn't this how we so often feel as we leave Passover with, I'm sure, very full stomachs, but also a renewed sense of pursuing justice? How often is it that that's how we describe Passover to our friends and family who are not Jewish? This is our holiday of freedom and justice. How often do we conclude a week of avoiding our usual foods and remind ourselves that perhaps we're more capable of discipline than we give ourselves credit for? That if we could do something for a week, if we can change our habits for these days, then can't we change other parts of our lives going forward? The story we tell this week is our story of moving from suffering to celebration. And so, to our children, the answer to their second question, how come others get to do more than I do? How come others get to celebrate more than I do? The answer is, they don't. But perhaps, if that is how you feel, then you may not be noticing how much you have to celebrate. And that is what Passover reminds us of as well. This year, more than most, we will notice what is different around our Seder tables. Perhaps some of those differences are due to COVID-19. Perhaps many are not. If we honor the story and tell it correctly, then we will leave our Seder tables having noted our accomplishments from this past year. We'll have noted the accomplishments of previous generations that they left for us to inherit. We will have marked the plagues of old and the plagues of 2020 and 2021. And we will celebrate what we have accomplished. We will leave optimistic about our future. That's how Jewish stories are told. That's how Jewish lives are to be lived. We do not deny our suffering, but we do not live entirely in it either. We let it lead us to our celebrations, to see ourselves in the stranger, ostracized by society, and to see our accomplishments in the face of our challenges as something worthy of raising a glass to acknowledge. So this week, Hag Pesach Sameach, may we have the holiday of Passover as a holiday to remind us of where we've been, the challenges we've faced, and our story of redemption. May it lead us, each of us, also to our story of celebration. Shabbat Shalom, Hag Sameach, for the holiday to come.